On First Street, Northeast Washington, D.C., near the U.S. Capitol and the White House, is a building home to some of the most powerful people in the nation, the Supreme Court. Here, 9 justices operate in this incredible building, which is the highest court in the land, where some of the most significant decisions have been made, shaping the law of the land. Established in 1789, the Supreme Court operated for nearly 2 centuries without a permanent home of its own. Before that, it existed in the legislative chambers of the original capital of New York City, then Philadelphia, and then the U.S. Congress in Washington, D.C. It took 150 years for it to finally get a place of its own, but when it was completed, it was worth the wait. It is a massive building of marble, a shrine to justice, democracy, and the rule of law. This is the fascinating story of the Supreme Court, not its legislative history, although that is equally important, but the building and all it represents. Welcome back to Geographics. I'm your host, Eric Malachite, and today's script was provided by James CJ. So be sure to show them some love as you deploy your likes and do all the things that help keep the eldritch beast that is the YouTube algorithm going. Let's get to it. In 1789, a year after the United States ratified the Constitution, the newly established Congress passed the Judiciary Act of 1789. This act established the Supreme Court with 6 justices. While the Supreme Court was established in the Constitution, it was done only in principle, guaranteeing its existence but not outlining any specifics, hence the need for the Judiciary Act. Today, the Supreme Court is located in the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. However, when it was founded, the capital was New York City, which has been identified as the first capital under the new Constitution. Then, in 1790, the capital was moved to Philadelphia. The Supreme Court operated in both temporary capitals in various locations. In New York City, they met in the Merchants Exchange Building, while in Philadelphia, they originally met in Independence Hall before moving to Old City Hall. Finally, in 1800, they officially moved to the newly established capital of Washington, D.C. However, they would still be without a dedicated space. Despite being in the nation's capital and a co-equal branch of government, the Supreme Court was not given a building of its own to operate from. It instead existed inside the Capitol building, operating in makeshift and often inadequate spaces around the building. Eventually, this was somewhat rectified with the construction of a second Senate chamber built underneath the original Senate chambers, where they took up residence from 1810 to 1860. Not long after moving into their new space, the British invasion of Washington took place, which saw the destruction of numerous government buildings and significant damage done to the Capitol. While the old Supreme Court chamber survived much of the attack, in 1814, structurally it did require substantial repairs. This led to other renovations to improve safety, like fireproofing, structural reinforcement, and ventilation improvements, which took until 1819. Once the Senate moved to its current chambers, the court moved upstairs to the Senate's old chamber. In the early 20th century, it became clear that the court lacked the independence from Congress that it needed. Then Chief Justice and former U.S. President William Howard Taft pushed for a dedicated building fitting of the highest court in the land. Taft believed in the co-equal branches of government and felt a dedicated building for the Supreme Court would help present these ideals more effectively. The fact that he was a former president gave him some leverage in the discussion, which he made ample use of to persuade Congress to fund the effort. Finally, in 1929, those efforts resulted in Congress approving funding for the Supreme Court's first permanent home in its 150-year history. However, it would be a few more years until the court finally had its dedicated space. Taft had a great deal of clout in Washington to shape the vision and execution of the Supreme Court building. That's why when it came to who would build this citadel of justice, he chose and successfully lobbied for Cass Gilbert, with whom he had a personal and professional relationship, having existed in similar circles for years. Now, in spite of how he got the role, Cass Gilbert had a stellar reputation behind him by this point. He'd worked on numerous state capitol buildings nationwide, including Minnesota, West Virginia, and Arkansas. He'd also been behind iconic structures like the U.S. Customs House, the Woolworth Building in New York City, and the Detroit Public Library. He was involved in some degree in the plans of the University of Texas and the St. Louis Art Museum. Gilbert's work in public buildings always used the Beaux-Arts style, which was a common style used for government buildings in the United States. It takes neoclassical revival and adds another layer of depth, detail, and drama to it. The core tenets of the style were grandiose, symmetrical, and ornamental design, pulling from the classical Greek and Roman architecture. This meant stone facades and elaborate, decorative features like grand entrances, columns, friezes, sculptures, and ornamental details. Gilbert's goal for the Supreme Court building was to create a temple of justice, which reflected the court's authority and dignity. Upon seeing Gilbert's completed designs, Congress officially approved the project in 1929 and appropriated $9.74 million, which is equivalent to over $182 million today. Before ground even broke on the project, its main champion, William Howard Taft, passed away on March 8, 1930. A few years later, in 1932, construction began in earnest. On October 13, 1932, Supreme Court Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes laid the cornerstone on the new Supreme Court building and said, "The Republic endures, and this is the symbol of its faith." His words underscored the importance not only of the building, but also of all it would come to represent. The stone was inscribed with the date and Justice, the Guardian of Liberty. The laying of the cornerstone was a common ceremonial practice that saw the literal first stone of the building laid to anchor the rest of the foundation. While the Supreme Court had already begun its construction earlier that year, this was still done to honor the building. With all the pieces in place, the plans drawn, funding approved, and the early work having been started, it was time to build this Temple of Justice after a century and a half of waiting. The Supreme Court was built during a precarious, rather devastating time in American history. When the project began, the nation was deep into the Great Depression. Funding for the project had been approved before the Depression began. But in a time when finances were tight, you might expect the project to face delays, setbacks, or even funding crunches. However, in the 1930s, on the back of the New Deal, the building of the Supreme Court was one of many federal courthouses completed in the decade. In fact, all but 5 states would have a new courthouse completed in the 1930s. While the Supreme Court endured several labor strikes throughout the project, it experienced little in terms of other major issues during the construction. Halfway through the project, the lead architect and visionary behind the Supreme Court building, Cass Gilbert, passed away on May 17, 1934. Like Taft, the man who lobbied for both the construction of a Supreme Court and for Gilbert himself, he'd never get to see the fruits of his efforts. His son, Cass Gilbert Jr., and associate John R. Rockert saw the project through. On April 4, 1935, the building of the Supreme Court was completed. On October 7, 1935, the new term for the justices began with Chief Justice presiding over the first session in the justices' new courtroom. The finished building was something both Taft and Gilbert would have been proud of. After a century and a half, the highest court in the land had an actual court that was theirs and theirs alone. While he didn't live to see the building completed, Gilbert Cass managed to see much of the exterior work finished before his death. His vision for this grand temple of justice was on full display, and it remains something to behold. The building's exterior was made from marble sourced from Vermont, while the interior used marble from Georgia and Alabama. When you look at the Supreme Court, it's not difficult to imagine it being some temple for a god in ancient Greece. In fact, the Supreme Court employs many architectural practices of that era, exemplified by the neoclassical style, as do most federal buildings, to tie it to ancient Greece and Rome, symbolizing the nation's democratic ideal. Beyond these ideals, it was down to a sense of importance felt in almost every major landmark in Washington, D.C., such as the Capitol, the White House, and monuments like the Lincoln and Jefferson memorials. The Supreme Court building is 175 feet tall, comprising 3 stories and a large rotunda. Immediately, you're greeted by a building of grandeur, with its large marble staircase of 44 stairs leading to the portico, featuring 16 marble columns. Above the entrance is the west pediment, which was the work of sculptor Robert I. Aitken, who was given free rein to choose the sculpture's subject matter. His final design incorporated 9 allegorical figures. From left to right, the allegorical figures are as follows: William Howard Taft, Elihu Root, who was on the building commission, Cass Gilbert, Order, Liberty Enthroned, Authority, former Chief Justice and presidential nominee Charles E. Hughes, Robert I. Aiken, and John Marshall, who was considered the father of the American judiciary. The west pediment exists above the inscription above the entrance, saying "Equal Justice Under Law." Before even making it up the steps, the right and left sides of the staircase feature two prominent statues, Contemplation of Justice to the left and Authority of Law to the right. Both statues were designed by James Earl Fraser and were installed in November 1935, a month before the Supreme Court opened. Contemplation of Justice features a woman with her left arm supported by a book of laws and a figure of blindfolded justice in her right hand. The statue, in Fraser's words, embodies the beauty and intelligence of justice. The Authority of Law is a male figure who awaits with authority, holding a tablet of laws, backed by a sheathed sword meant to symbolize the enforcement through law. On the tablet is lex, which is Latin for law. One of the most impressive features of the Supreme Court building is the main doors, known as the Bronze Doors, which depict a history of law that most people don't get a chance to see as visitors enter through the ground floor. If you've ever been able to, you'll find yourself wanting to marvel at an impressive sight. These doors tell a story and are a marvel to behold. The court's entrance continues its grand design with the bronze doors. Designed by Gilbert and John Donnelly Jr., the doors are 17 feet high and 9.5 feet wide. They weigh 13 tons apiece, and each door features bas-reliefs, which are sculptures with designs that stand out slightly from the background, in this case, the flat surface of a door. These sculptures each represent the evolution of justice in Western tradition and are arranged chronologically from the lower left panel and moving up to the top, then to the bottom right of the opposite door to conclude at the top. Starting at the bottom left-hand side is the Shield of Achilles, described by Homer's Iliad, where two men bring their argument before the elders for judgment. Then there's Praetor's Edict, where a Roman magistrate published his edict proclaiming the validity of common or judge-made law. A soldier is featured to represent the government's power to enforce the common law. The third sculpture is Julian and Scholar. Julian was a prominent law teacher in ancient Rome. In this depiction, he's instructing a pupil, representing, in Donnelly's words, the development of law by scholar and advocate. To finish off the left side of the door is the Justinian Code, which features Roman Emperor Justinian ordering the publication of Corpus Juris Civilis, considered to be the first codification of Roman law. Moving over to the right door panel, we start at the bottom with the Magna Carta panel, where, in 1215, King John of England was coerced by the barons to place his seal upon said Magna Carta, establishing that nobody was above the law and the rights of the people were guaranteed. The next panel is Westminster Statute, in which King Edward I watches his chancellor publish the Statute of Westminster in 1275. Donnelly said it's the greatest single legal reform in our history. Second to last is Coke and James I, which depicts Lord Chief Justice Coke barring King James from the King's Court, establishing the court as independent of the executive branch of government by law. Finally, the last panel is Marshall and Story, which depicts Chief Justice John Marshall and Associate Justice Joseph Story discussing the 1803 Marbury v. Madison opinion before the Capitol. John Donnelly said this about his work on the doors of the Supreme Court. Out of all of our monumental projects spread over 2 lifetimes, the Supreme Court doors are the only work that we ever signed. That's how important they were. His signature appears on the bottom right corner of the Magna Carta panel, another name forever tied to the grandeur of one of Washington, D.C., and America's most prominent buildings. Depending on who you are, your entrance to the Supreme Court might be different. The bronze doors are only used by the 9 justices of the Supreme Court on ceremonial occasions and special events. It's also used by heads of state and official visitors, while the 9 justices regularly use a more private entrance. Touring visitors use the lower-level public entrance located beneath the grand staircase, while lawyers who are there to argue cases enter through a designated security-screened entrance. The ground floor, or lower level, features support and public facilities, including a cafeteria, gift shop, press rooms, restrooms, security screening areas for lawyers and visitors, the clerk's office, administrative staff, and mechanical and storage areas. This level is the engine room of the Supreme Court, and among all the floors, it is the least ceremonial, meaning that the grandeur of design we have been alluding to isn't as pronounced on this floor of the building. In the center of the west end of the building is a statue of John Marshall, who served as the 4th Chief Justice from 1801 to 1835. The statue features Marshall in his judicial robe, with his left hand holding a document and his right hand outstretched as if discussing the document. Interestingly, the statue of the former Chief Justice predates the Supreme Court's approval or construction. Instead, it was first proposed following Marshall's death in Philadelphia on July 6, 1835. The Bar of Philadelphia attempted to raise funds for the statue, and while donations were made, by 1880 they'd only managed to raise $20,000, which is equivalent to roughly $650,000 today, and half of what was needed. This remained insufficient, and so Congress footed the rest of the bill, approving the measure on March 10, 1882. William Wetmore Story was hired to sculpt the statue. In almost a poetic way, Story was a lawmaker turned sculptor, and the son of Joseph Story, who had served with Marshall as an associate justice. The statue was cast in bronze in Rome, and on May 10, 1884, it was installed on the west front of the U.S. Capitol building. It wasn't until 1980 that the statue was moved inside the Supreme Court in preparation for Ronald Reagan's inauguration, which was to be the first half on the west front of the Capitol. Upon entering the Supreme Court building from the bronze doors onto what's considered the first floor, you'll find the level of grandeur that the exterior exudes. This floor serves as the ceremonial and public reception area, featuring the Great Hall, the courtroom, conference rooms, and exhibition areas. The first thing any visitor would see is the Great Hall. This beautiful space measures 300 feet in length and 30 feet in width, with a marble corridor running the entire length of the building. The marble corridor is lined with 36 Doric columns, each weighing 14 tons, which are single marble blocks from Alabama. Between the columns are busts of all the former Chief Justices currently standing at 16. The hallway culminates in the courtroom. The hall serves not only as a gathering place for those attending arguments, but also for ceremonial occasions. Much like the exterior of the Supreme Court, the interior features many nuanced details, including the frieze in the Great Hall. Existing 40 feet from the ground, the frieze contains relief panels featuring 15 individual metopes, which are square panels depicting animals, objects, gods, goddesses, and historic lawgivers. Some examples include an owl representing wisdom and meditation, a book and torches representing education and knowledge, Juno representing the genius of womanhood, and Solomon representing wisdom and magnificence. It should come as no surprise that the Supreme Court has only one courtroom. This imposing room sits at the heart of the building, and Gilbert ensured it was constructed using imported materials, giving it the most attention of any room in the building. The marble used comes from Italy, Algeria, and Spain, and features a warmer color than the marble found in the rest of the building, which is a brighter white, or one might say white. The ceiling is 40 feet high and features a repeating pattern of 4 distinct white plaster rosettes with gold leafing. Unlike many decorative features in the building, these don't contain any symbolic meaning. The court features a bench at the back where the justices, 9 at present, sit during arguments. Before them is the lectern, used by attorneys making their oral arguments, completed with lights indicating the time remaining for their arguments. Finally, there are benches for observers. Above the bench is the East Frieze, which features 2 central male figures. One, Majesty of Law, holding a book of law, and the other, Power of Government, holding the fasces, an ancient Roman symbol of authority. The West Frieze, on the opposite side, has 2 central female figures, one being Justice, leaning on a sheathed sword to represent her might, and the other is Divine Inspiration, featured as a winged figure holding the scales of justice. Additionally, there are 2 other figures on the left. Wisdom, with an owl owl on his shoulder, and on the opposite side is Truth, holding a mirror and a rose. The walls are made of mahogany paneling, gold accents, and are completed with deep red drapes to signify authority. In theory, this room could appear simple at first glance, impressive but straightforward. However, it's when you pay attention that you notice all the minor details and emphasis put on this great space where some of the nation's most important decisions emanate from. Finally, the third floor is reserved almost entirely for the justices. This is the working heart of the building, which is both private and secure for the justices and their clerks to research, deliberate, and draft their opinions in shaping the law in the United States. While each justice has their own chamber, they are stately, not ostentatious. Additionally, there is a library that starts on the second floor and extends into the third floor. The library contains thousands of legal texts and serves as a valuable resource for the justices whenever they require additional material to inform their judgments and opinions. The public doesn't get to see this part of the Supreme Court, and it's mainly for the justices themselves and their clerks. Due to the building's brief existence, it has only experienced one significant renovation effort, which took place between 2003 and 2010. The renovations cost an estimated $122 million and included the addition of metal detectors, modern security cameras, reinforced entrances, structural reinforcements, accessibility improvements, energy efficiency enhancements, preservation efforts, and modernization of plumbing, electrical, and HVAC systems. The security upgrades were largely driven by the 9/11 attacks, which by 2003 were still fresh in the minds of everyone in the nation, but especially in Washington, D.C. and New York City. It was as a result of the security changes that the bronze doors began being used less and less for people coming in, something several justices weren't happy about, even if they understood it to a certain extent. The Supreme Court is far more than just a building. Along with the U.S. Capitol building and the White House, it represents the three co-equal branches of government. Unfortunately, Americans don't see any of those branches favorably in the 21st century. The building was designed to convey the sense of gravitas and power that the Supreme Court embodies, solidifying its independence from the other branches of government by providing it with its own dedicated space. Today, those lines are increasingly becoming blurred in an increasingly partisan environment. It's a question of what the checks and balances will look like in the 3 years to come. Will this monument to the principles of justice and fairness be able to, or be willing to, defend the Constitution it's sworn to uphold? It's a question everyone wishes had a clear answer, but today, it's anyone's guess. I hope you learned something today, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to deploy your likes, comment a historical location we haven't covered yet, subscribe, and ring that bell, and share this video with someone who enjoys learning about history's most famous locations. I'm Eric Malachite, and we'll see you next time.